And then as I started sitting with the images, collating, sorting, sequencing, I went, wow, there's some really interesting conversations here between these diptychs. And I had very much started to understand how many of these rural communities had fallen into decline, but not only rural communities, but suburbs on the outskirts of the major cities, or even suburbs within cities where massive malls had been built in Tokyo. And the street that used to sell exclusively a certain kind of cookware was now completely shuttered because people would go to the equivalent of American big box stores, but they'd go to a Japanese mall to buy their cookware. They didn't go to the one street that was famous for cookware anymore. In not dissimilar a way that we spoke of earlier about, villages going into decline in the United States. But I think that's probably more economically driven than driven by the factors that are affecting Japan. I mean, Japan has a very low birth rate and a very old population. So the population as a whole has been declining for a long time. And young people have been leaving rural centres to go to the major city centres for employment and education. So what you can imagine here in this village, in this image on the left, for example, again in Shima Onsen, is with no new children being born into these villages, eventually the schools close down. And then once the local schools close, those people move to a city where there is a school that's active and there's more children. So increasingly these smaller towns and villages and regional centres are falling into decline because the villages basically become unsustainable. There's not enough people living in these cities to leave the lights on.
Welcome to the show, Damien.
Thanks so much. Great to see you, Patrick.
So excited to have you on. I've been diving into your world. You have a wide breadth of experience and filmmaking and art. I guess it's production design, film design. I'm losing the word right now for some weird reason. But
production design
you
is
have,
correct. Yeah.
There you go. Production design. And you have some big names or big films that you've been a part of, but you also have this photography passion that has gone along with it. That has been, would you say it's been feeding your world or supplementing? How would you describe that? Would it be congruent, just going alongside that photography passion? How would you describe that?
I think the photography passion's been with me since my teenage years, but it's really only since 2015 that I shared it more publicly. And I guess the boundaries become more and more indistinct between my professional practice as an art director and production designer and as a photographer. And I guess they do feed into each other. And in a discussion with Steve Bisson for the journal on Urbanaut, I mentioned that I think having a visual practice supplementary to working in the built environment for film allows me a different kind of discourse with cinematographers and others as well, because
I love it.
It's a broader scope than just a strict set building practice.
Well, and I think that's why you're perfect for this show and perfect for the discourse that we have. I think you're going to offer such a interesting take on the conversations that we have here. So before we begin, go ahead, for those who don't know you, go ahead and introduce yourself to the audience.
Okay. My name's Damien Drew. I am based in Sydney, Australia. I work as an art director and production designer in the film industry, and am equally passionate about photography and our relationship to the built environment.
It's awesome. So talk to me a little bit about you. You had mentioned that as a teenager, you you were very interested in photography. So talk to me a little bit about Damien's origin story. How did you find that passion? How did you come about it? Were you always artistic or artistically inclined? Was it something you've always had? Talk to me a little bit about how you found your way into photography and how that developed.
As cliched as it sounds, I think a lot of people have the story that, they went through high school, but there was one teacher who was like, actually got your attention in the 95% of things that you were meant to learn that you didn't actually learn. And we were lucky to have a strong art department in my high school, and there was some one or two dark rooms at the high school that had been set up for photography practice. So I was probably about 15 or 16 when I first started getting some tuition in photography in high school, and it was definitely a lot more engaging for me than maths and chemistry and team sport. So I spent a lot of time in the art department. My mother was also a pretty keen film photographer and a cousin, so I had some family exposure there as well. But it wasn't, in fact, until one of my older cousins, for his 21st birthday present, was gifted some darkroom equipment and the like, and I don't think ever really took an interest in it, that I hijacked that from him and set up a darkroom under the house and started doing some of my own practice in my teen years and bringing home what I was learning at school and sort of experimenting by taking photos of friends and family and, just the environment around me, really, with no understanding at that point, I guess, of art theory or, our relationship to the built environment, that's for sure.
It shows up in your work, that relationship to the built environment and that curiosity there. And it's translated into a career. But you didn't study photography. You went into architecture. So talk to me about that decision and that direction per se.
My mother hates this story because she vehemently denies it, but I remember explicitly sitting at the dinner table talking about career opportunities, and both her and my father encouraged me to be an applied artist, as you might say. Study an applied art like architecture or engineering or something where there's like a perceived professional discipline there. And I guess I yielded to that advice, and I did end up studying architecture, but I don't actually regret that for 1 minute, because I actually think it is possibly the best and broadest design education that you can get. And a lot of students come to me now and say, look, if I want to work in the film industry or I want to do this, what would you suggest I study? And I don't encourage them to go to film school. I encourage them to study architecture, or at least even the first degree. In Australia, it's split into 2 degrees, like a Bachelor of Science in Architecture, I believe, and then a Master's of Architecture. And even the first 3-year degree gives you an incredible design grounding, because you learn about design history, you learn about theory, you learn about art and architecture through the ages. And whether you end up turning that to furniture design or photography practice or interior design or product design, I still maintain it's an incredibly broad education in art history and the built environment, and you have to learn about all the components that comprise architecture to arrive at architecture, if that makes sense.
Is it more like structural engineering kind of thing? Is it like you understand the meat and potatoes part of it, the skull and bones?
Yeah, I guess so. I mean, I think when you study architecture, though, you study architects who designed furniture and who designed objects. So you start at the human experience. You start at the human experience, how we inhabit space and how we relate to objects, and then it grows out from there into buildings and then streets and landscapes and urban planning. So it's a great degree, and I guess I kept fiddling, I suppose is the word, in photography, but I don't think I really got interested in visual storytelling until I started studying a lot of American photographers of the late 20th century who'd started documenting the built environment.
That's awesome. I'm kind of curious a little bit about, you parlayed that into a production design career, and so you in a sense started to use that to construct images for film. So talk to me about how that happened. And
it's really interesting. And again, the students that I speak to periodically at AIT or the Australian Film and Television Radio School, and occasionally I get invited to come and speak about my experience or speak about a specific project, which I enjoy doing. It's sort of an opportunity to give back and also reflect on your own work and your own practice. But my migration into film was pretty accidental, and the students hate this answer because it's perceived as a difficult industry to get into around the world. But I was studying. I had studied architecture, and I'd worked probably 3 or 4 years postgraduate for some big commercial firms, and as well as set up my own little studio doing domestic design in Surrey Hills here in Sydney. And Fox Studios opened in Sydney late 90s, and a friend of mine was working on a Jim Henson TV show based at Fox Studios, and they needed set designers to come in and start drawing these environments. And whilst we'd had big films in Australia before, we'd certainly had big location-based films and films that had built sets. We hadn't had a long tradition of building very big environments that were to come in the years following, Star Wars and Matrix and others, where it really were kind of world-building projects. And so I went in to do what was offered to me at the time as a couple of months' work on this Jim Henson series called Farscape, which was a combination of live action and puppeteering, these amazing alien puppets that the Jim Henson Company made. And I was working for a British designer called Ricky Ayres. And I thought all my dreams had come true. All of a sudden, here I was drawing spaceships and off-world environments and these incredible things without the boundaries of like statutory approval by local government and all of these kind of very dry aspects to architecture that are less appealing. And I thought, wow, this is fantastic. And then, here I am 28 years later, still doing it. Architecture is a wonderful craft as well, but I guess I've taken that skill set and turned it to something a little bit different.
I think it's fascinating. Or, when you look at the films that you've worked on, a lot of them are world building and somewhat sci-fi, somewhat not. Do you kind of jump from one project to the next, or do you find yourself now kind of selecting those where you get to kind of invent, make? I know you do have some films that you've done. Your recent one, Elvis, and you have some other ones too that aren't necessarily all completely, I guess sci-fi per se. But do you have a preference between the two? Do you like to just be purely creative, or do you just to just be involved?
I think I'm just attracted to anything with good storytelling, to be honest. And Elvis was my second project with Baz Luhrmann and Catherine Martin. The first being Great Gatsby. And even though you might perceive, I guess, or the audience might perceive that world building for The Matrix or Superman or Star Wars is got a greater breadth or more opportunity, the interesting thing about a film like Elvis is that, we shot that in Australia, and yet we're doing 1950s Memphis, through to 1970s, and we don't have that architecture here.
Come on.
No, we built the exterior of Graceland in
that's amazing.
In a farmer's field on the Gold Coast. So,
wow.
I mean, there were digital extensions to that environment, but we built like 1.5 stories of the exterior of Gracelands. That was headed up by an art director called Matt Wynn, who I work with here in Australia, a great colleague of mine. And so I guess what I'm trying to say there is you might perceive that, there's less involved with that, but there's definitely as much world building in Elvis as there is in The Matrix.
You can see you would have to have a knowledge of art history for sure, or at least architectural history, to understand what was being built at that time, and all that other stuff.
True, but we all do an incredible amount of research. Like in those big art departments, we have design assistants and people doing research and feeding the beast the whole time, because none of us were there in 1950s Memphis, and we might think we have an idea what it should look like, but it does involve an extensive amount of research from everything, from the wardrobe designs of Catherine Martin, costume design, and the history of fabrics and textures and colors, right through to the cars and the props. We need to drill down into everything. And Baz used to say, look, we've got to be forensic. That was his term that he used in looking at these things.
I bet you do look at a lot of photographs too. You're like, was that, and it's, I think that's interesting.
Interestingly, photographers like, I'm sure I'll say his name wrong, but Saul Leiter, Leiter, and these photographers that were first using color photography in the 50s and 60s, they became very, very much informed the palettes and some of the approach to those films as well. So we do actually study photographers and photography when looking at those things.
I think it's interesting. So talk to me about your photography practice during all of this. So you have this career that, it started, and 28 years later, it's, still going on, and you're still doing stuff.
And easy. I mean, I obviously have worked hard along with all my colleagues in those years, but I guess the point is, like, I never went, I'm going to give up architecture. There was no tipping point where I'm like, okay, enough architecture. Now I'm doing film. It just happened quite organically.
That's how this stuff happens. Yeah. It's having the right skill set and ready to go when the opportunity strikes. And there's some people that say, well, you got lucky, right? But personally, I've always looked at luck as when preparation meets opportunity. And so you were ready for it. You were primed for it. It's, and then all of a sudden, it just kind of parlays into the next thing. And that's a lot of times that's the advice that I hear and give. It's just prepare yourself for the opportunity that you want, and then it's there. But I'm also kind of curious about this underlying passion of photography, because we're going to look at some of your photography work. We're going to get to look at some of your production design with Elvis, if I'm not mistaken. But talk to me a little bit about photography and how you were developing your skills and you continued to kind of create this practice. Was it always going on? Did you lose it at one point? Talk to me about that current underneath all of this.
I was always shooting, and I've got, like a lot of photographers, I'm sure, boxes and boxes of negatives that have never seen the light of day. And I shot a lot of film photography through the late 90s and sort of earlier part of the 2000s. But it was sort of incidental observations. It was like, here I am, wherever I'm traveling, wherever I'm working. And I'd shoot textures, I'd shoot paint finishes, I'd shoot abandoned building facades. It was just incidental photography, I guess. And, I would often see things that I thought were strong images or I felt I had a connection to, but I think the narrative was building over time. And you talk about opportunity, skill set meeting opportunity. It was only when, at the conclusion of a Michael Mann film that I'd been shooting in Malaysia, that I went to the States for a friend's wedding, went to Los Angeles for the wedding, and then got a call from Ian Gracie and Baz Luhrmann and CM's team to see if I would go to Miami, South Beach, to help them design and work on a mid-century hotel in South Beach, Miami, that was to be turned by an Argentinian developer called Alan Faina into this wonderful mid-century hotel conversion. And I worked on that for a couple of months with the team. And then I decided I would ride a motorcycle back to Los Angeles, as you do. So I hired a motorcycle far too late in the year. It was already November. And this silly Australian thought it would be a good time to ride from Miami to Los Angeles in November. And
it's a little rainy.
To further complicate that is my visa was running out. So I had a very limited amount of time to get back to Los Angeles before I overstayed my visa. And I had this ideal in my head, you know, having continued taking photos through these years, that I would shoot my journey from from Miami to LA. And I had this fantasy ideal, I suppose, that I would find the environments of Stephen Shaw and Joel Sternfeld, and I'd find these wonderful towns full of giant Cadillacs and colorful people and vibrant shop fronts and vibrant villages. And I had a very different experience. And I think that was the first time that I started taking images and went, I think there's a story here that's worth sharing. And I think there's a narrative here that I can communicate through pictures. And I traveled 18 days on that bike, often very, very cold and very, very wet, from Miami to LA. And, you know, it was a bucket list experience, to coin a cliche, but I'm really glad I did it, because that trip garnered the material for first series and first exhibition and book that I had here in Sydney.
Now I'm curious, what kind of motorcycle were you riding?
I was riding a late model. It wasn't terribly new, but it was a late model R1200 GS BMW. Okay, so you're going cross country. The thing is, it was about like the South, and in that region, it probably started to clear up once you started to get to the West. But it's really rainy in that time of year, it can be a biting. It was cold.
It can be biting cold. But... yeah, because the humidity mixed in with that cold air is just. But you know, I remember the title of a truck driver straight out of Central Casting pulled me up in a truck stop somewhere outside of New Orleans, and he said, without the expletives, he said, you know, what the hell's wrong with you? And I said, nothing. I'm Australian. I said nothing. I'm Australian, and he goes, "Oh, that makes sense. That's fine. That's fine." But he thought I'd lost my mind. Yeah. Yeah. But you know, I think that dream of doing a road trip with a camera across the United States is one that a lot of us photographers have. It's something that I've dreamt of doing, and I'm kind of curious about what it is that you found and what you noticed. I know you wrote about it, but I just want to hear it in your words. What kind of story you were unveiling?
Yeah, that's what was interesting. Is I don't think anything really prepared me for the sameness or the homogeneity of like these landscapes. You know, there was the same. I forget the actual brand now, but there was the same chain motels, the same gas stations, the same big box stores, just about in every single town I drove into. And then somewhere, usually on the approach to that town or exiting that town, was a deserted high street that had once obviously been the central hub of these townships. And, you know, there was your traditional, very archetypal American facades, you know, these shop fronts all in a row and 2-lane highway running through the street. But there often wasn't anyone there anymore, or there was one cafe open, and most of the other shops were boarded up, because I think everyone was driving to the mall and going to TK Maxx and going to all of these big box stores. And I think part of me was disappointed, because I expected to find the fabric that I'd seen Joel Sternfeld and Stephen Shaw and these others document in the late 70s. And I found it this very different nation that I guess was perched somewhere between, you know, decaying regeneration. You know, it was sort of a really funny sort of contradiction. And so I started taking photos of these remnant building facades, which in hindsight are very much like sets. You know, they're the facades of these buildings that are sitting in the landscape, doors locked, Venetian blinds down, just quite monumental often in their style. And I shot them all front on, not with any intent at the time, but when I got home and I started reviewing these images in the years that followed, months and years that followed, I realized that I'd shot them all pretty much as straight elevations, as you would draw a building if you were going to build it as a film set. And so it became this series of sort of postcards, snapshots, I guess, of a time that had gone before. And I ended up calling the series Everywhere Was Wherever, which spoke to, I guess, both the sense of personal alienation I felt riding this motorcycle across the country going, where do I go next? Like, it felt quite arbitrary in a sense, because everywhere I arrived felt quite often like the place I'd just been, you know, because I kept identifying these chain businesses and the like. I mean, obviously that's not true of a place like New Orleans or Big Bend National Park. I mean, these places all have very unique identities, but it's everywhere in between. You know, I was quite surprised by the condition of a lot of the southern states and the smaller villages and towns that I went through.
Yeah, it's you got to what year was that again?
That was 2013. I took the images, but it wasn't until much later that I went, oh, maybe this is a story that's worth telling. And I had the exhibition and the book in 2015.
Yeah, because I think what you are witnessing is what I've been having many conversations with different artists on this show, is this post-industrial age America. It's this shift that you're starting to notice, and it's this commercialization that's happening where it's all Walmarts. They all have a Walmart. They all have a Motel 6. They all have...
They're the brands that I saw.
The same gas station. Exactly. Or I think, I forget the other one. Holiday Inn is the other one. And so you have like these same things, and they're all the same truck stops. Now the truck stop might change names, but it's the same layout. You know what I mean? In almost every place that you go, and the only progress really just seems to be what new big box store drops into this place, but the rest of the city and the rest of the town is kind of degrading around it. And I think that is really, really interesting. And I'm curious if it had kind of an effect on you. Did it spur on further research, or did it just leave you with a strange kind of question that needs answering? I'm curious what the effects on you were.
Yeah, look, it was I definitely had some great experiences in those 18 days. I met some great people, and, you know, definitely stopped in some vibrant places and had good fun. It wasn't all kind of, decay and destruction. But as I went across these states, it became very apparent to me that nowhere was really insulated from this. And, you know, people talk about driving Route 66, for example. Route 66 is a bunch of kind of like dissociated lengths of road that are chopped up by other highways that have been replaced by major highways. And I guess I had this very romantic vision of, I don't know, Thelma and Louise overtaking me in their convertible on this Route 66 that rode its way all the way across the states. And it's just, I don't know, it's just not the case. Like, and I think it was, on some levels, it was quite a lonely experience, because I obviously didn't know people along the way to stop and visit. And I've mentioned before in some writings and talks that it was weirdly it became sort of a search for personal identity as much as a geographic identity as you moved across the country. Because I'm like,
yeah,
you sort of pause and you go, why am I doing this again? Like it often feels it can feel quite arbitrary. Like, why did I choose to undertake this? And what am I doing by photographing these building facades? But I think when I got home and sat with it and started to look at my own country, it's no different here. We have exactly the same forces.
I was going to ask you that.
It's really no different. And I think it's becoming a global phenomenon. It really is quite interesting.
I have this one. Go ahead, please.
I was just going to say, as an example, in the 90s and 2000s, we had an amazing Sydney sort of iconic cafe that opened in a couple of locations. It was called Bill's, after a famous celebrity chef who sadly is now passed, called Bill Granger. So we had a couple of cafes, Bill's, and you'd go to the local cafe and you'd think, that's amazing, that's Bill's. You go to Seoul in Korea today, a city of 25 plus million people, there's a Bill's in Seoul. There's a Starbucks in Seoul. There's a Starbucks in Sydney. Whilst my book was titled Everywhere is Wherever, in terms of a micro sense, traveling across the States, I think it's now happens internationally. You could be in Dubai airport. It looks exactly the same as Atlanta airport. You would struggle to kind of find a distinction because all the same brands are there and all the same. Whereas I remember traveling, 20-something years ago, Bangkok airport was Bangkok airport. There was no mistaking it. Like, it was a very, very unique in terms of the shops and the building fabric and everything else. And I guess in a way, I lament this homogenous kind of environment that we now find ourselves in, where's your hometown, for example? Where did you grow up?
I grew up in Dallas-Fort Worth.
Right.
So I
went through Dallas as well.
Yeah, you do on that stretch. Yeah.
Yeah. But I mean, I just find it a very interesting global phenomena. And I guess that's something that then fascinated me when I went to subsequent countries and cities as well.
It's I'm going to reference one of your films that you worked on. It's like seeing The Matrix. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. It's kind of this, you start to kind of see a larger thing playing. And I think, the iPhone and this type of technological revolution that we've had, with computers and stuff has changed our world so fast that I think we still don't even understand the ramifications of it. And now we have AI coming and all these other things. And I had another artist on, his name was Andrew Borowick, and he was looking at the Rust Belt, which is that Ohio area, that area in the I guess you could call it the Upper Midwest or whatever. But I guess that's more that way. But this this little area, you would have seen the same thing. And he also spends time in France. And he started to do that same study on post-industrial cities in France and in Belgium. And he's seeing the same kind of phenomenon that's going on that you noticed. And I think it's interesting. You have this creative job of world building and doing all of that stuff. And you probably have a different look at it and a different take on it. Does it feel eerie? Does it feel,
I think,
does that make sense?
It does feel eerie, but I think probably why I first started noticing is when you spend hours and hours at a drawing board drawing tiny details about buildings, and you get this appetite for understanding how everything works, like how the door meets the door jamb, how the window closes on the sill, how the brick meets the door. Like, you have to understand how those junctions come to be in order to draw them, whether it's on CAD on a computer in 2D or 3D or as I started out drawing pencil and tracing paper. So I've always been super curious of what, about my environment. And so I think what I just came to notice was, studying buildings, looking at the pavement, looking at the stairs, you start to develop a bit of a, I guess an internal landscape of how these things unfold and and indeed how they're changing. I see it in Sydney. We have old high streets that, overnight seem to be turned into apartment blocks, and these wonderful 1920s, 1930s shop facades overnight get replaced by some generic apartment building. And I find that quite tragic because, with the loss of those places also goes the history of the people who made them and the stories that went behind them.
Yeah.
I think ultimately that's my motivation for, telling the stories that I subsequently told in Japan.
It's interesting.
And prompted me to share that first story in the States.
I think it's an interesting kind of jumping off point. We're about to look at that. And but before we do, I think it's going to spur on some more conversations once we get to your two latest photographic bodies of work. But talk to me a little bit about some of your inspirations. Who inspires you? Who do you just look at and go, yes, this is it? Anybody?
I think like a lot of, it's interesting, particularly with the advent of Instagram, I noticed a lot of people, including myself, getting more and more fascinated with the American South. And, there's accounts after accounts devoted to documenting decaying gas stations and, old facades. And, it's kind of a trope now on Instagram, the American South, in a way. And I'm not saying that's a bad thing. It's fascinating for a reason, but I think a lot of that grew out of the likes of Stephen Shaw and Joel Sternfeld and those group of photographers who I think, if my history is correct, were engaged by the US government initially to go out and take a snapshot of America in those decades. Yeah. So they weren't going out there to create fine art. They'd been paid in a sense as kind of documentary photographers to get a snapshot of this America at this point in time. But somehow their images over time have become regarded as fine art. And I'm still, William Eggleston. There's a particular, I guess, period there from the 60s through to the 80s that I find really compelling, the advent of color and that documentary style that both documented America at this particular point in time, but did it in a very particular way. I find those images fascinating, and I have many, many books by those artists.
Yeah. Understandably so. Stephen Shore comes up, and I think probably every episode that I've done. I'm just kidding. Not every one of them, but he's a very common name that comes up, and I think it's awesome, and I think it's going to lead into where we're about to go. So I'm kind of curious about taking a look at your into some of your production design. So you said you have a little PDF that you had prepared for an award ceremony, and so you're going to kind of take us through a little bit of that, and then we get the chance to look at your photography, which I'm quite taken by. And you even have one of your images right behind you, which I'm on
my dining room wall. I have an image from Wabi-Sabi. At least the bottom corner of it, but
yeah. And I love the frame.
So
I always like a white frame. Yeah. What's that?
What would you like to have a look first? Is it one of the film projects?
Let's look at your production design first.
Okay.
And let's kind of see. I like to see that creative side of you and the research that goes into it, and how you look at constructing that stuff, how it makes its way, and I think that's really, really interesting. And then let's pivot into some of your work there.
So this is a document that I presented for one of our industry guild awards, and it takes you through a few of the environments for Elvis, which was a film that came out, I think, 2 years ago now. We were, in fact, only 3 days away from shooting this film when, with all the sets standing in the stages, when the world stopped from COVID. So we were all sent home and spent another 5 months deliberating about how and when the film may or may not start up again. But it basically is a story of Elvis's life from birth, almost up to his demise. And it's ultimately a very sad story, but we were charged with creating a lot of different environments. And this is quite an extensive document, so we can look at as much or as little of it as you see fit. So this is some final frames from the film of the finished set. And this was the Shake Rag, which are black communities in the American South. Very simple buildings. And Elvis grew up in something not dissimilar. These are concept illustrations by Chris Tagney, who's one of our team, working under supervising art director Ian Gracie and our production designers Karen Murphy and Catherine Martin. And these sort of convey the tone and texture of where we head. So we would start out typically with this kind of imagery to then arrive at the finished set pieces. These are actually frames from the film. Some concepts, illustrations, bottom right, locations, top right. That image on the left is part of the finished gas station at the Shake Rag. And what I was starting to describe before was often we use photographic reference. So these images in the top right here are by Gordon Parks, who was famous for documenting in colour these communities at that time. This would have been 30s and 40s. Site plans for the set, 3D concept drawings by our team. These are some of my own black and white stills that I shot on the finished set. So you can see here the actual builds and the dressed interiors, this wallpaper here, wallpapered with newspaper.
What an opportunity. It's like
incredible. Yeah.
Well, to be able to photograph in those environments, it's almost like it's like this whole team that helps you kind of construct it. A lot of times as a photographer, you're doing this by yourself. And so you're photographing your immediate environment, but like this is a constructed world and you get this opportunity.
Yeah. And look, this is not something that I'm charged to do. This is not part of my job remit.
No.
but
no.
It always, on these films, it always feels like a wasted opportunity because there's no one charged to doing this during the filmmaking process. So these are photos that I've taken on set with cast and extras, generally as they're waiting between shots. These kids here were just waiting, but in the final film, you'll see a scene very similar to what's in that top image. And I shot these on my GFX 50R Fujifilm.
Yeah.
And
nice camera.
And I just, I just felt compelled to make sure we had a record of our work. So the motivation was driven by that, quite selfishly.
Do you always take photos?
Look, not always. Often I don't get time. I mean, often I really don't get the time. And I often don't get to see the sets lit. So they're not fully lit, like the lighting department. Well, they get lit for the shooting, but they won't typically run the lights so that you can do a separate still shoot, if that makes sense. There are what they call unit photographers who are on set all the time, but they're more often focused on cast and talent than they are on the built environment. So these two frames at the bottom are mine, and that scene of the kids, for anyone familiar with the film, they run up they see this beautiful woman sitting outside, they hear the music, and they run up to the outside of the juke joint here, and they peer through the tin to see this scene unfolding that's at the top of the page. Again, more construction drawings, one of my stills of the finished set. And I guess the only reason I had the opportunity to shoot this particular set is it's not my set. I went out there to visit it, Tuesday Stone and Catherine Martin and Karen Murphy and the rest of the team are running around orchestrating, finishing, detailing this set. And I had an opportunity to take stills. This set is a set that I supervised, and we built almost 3 city blocks of Beale Street in the 50s. And most of these buildings were recreated from history images and then drawn by a large team of set designers. Right. So this is our condensation, I guess, of Beale Street in the 50s. It's not, forensically correct, I guess, in every sense of like where the buildings are located, which ones are opposite which. but it was because there's there was a period in Beale Street's history where it was very, very vibrant, but as the 60s and 70s went on, a lot of it went into ruin and was affected by the race riots, and so it's very hard to get a snapshot of this actual piece of history at that point in time. This top image here.
Talking about that, go ahead. I'm sorry. Finish. Go ahead. Say that again.
This top image, all the foreground are our real buildings, but all that background is like digitally extended.
Gotcha.
And the bottom 3 images are all within our set. So the vehicles, the dressing, and everything there.
It's interesting. I am curious when you get to do this, you're working on the front end. So you're creating 3D renders. And I always ask this, my partner is a architecture interior design person. So she's always doing 3D renders of things. And I ask her this, which is it, what's it like to kind of see it realized? I know it never actually ends up being exactly as you envision. There's always some kind of modifications that make it happen. But what's it like to kind of step in the world that's been constructed?
Look, it's pretty fantastic. I mean, it takes a big team. I mean, on a film like Elvis, there were 3 art directors working under our supervising art director, 4 or 5 assistant art directors, probably 10 or 12 set designers, model makers, design assistants, graphic designers. I think we had 3 or 4 graphic designers. So it's a huge team effort. And in my role, I'm coordinating a lot of those processes. I'm not directly generating drawings in my role these days. But, I am supervising the team. A lot of them have an architectural training. So this drawing here was drawn by, I think, Rachel Van Baal, who is architecturally trained. And so each of these buildings, we scheduled the street. We decided which buildings, colorways, details. And you can see on this drawing here, for example, the minutiae of all the window details. Every part of that has to be considered and documented. These are more of my color stills.
The final product.
Finished, yeah.
Wow. It's really interesting.
Design.
I do. I'm putting this into relation to a photography practice, and I'm seeing this kind of make its way into images, the especially the ones you're taking yourself, and how they end up kind of manifesting themselves as a frame in a movie or a still. It's quite interesting, and I'm curious if if that translates into the work that you do in your photography. Do you find yourself constructing an image, or do you find that since you are often, kind of constructing these worlds and building these worlds, that you try to just take your hands off it a little bit. How does that translate into your photography?
Into my personal photography practice?
Yeah. I'm curious if this detail-oriented world-building construction, how it translates and does it influence you? Does it?
I think it definitely does. But I think it probably more than anything, the architectural training and the discipline that comes through practicing this kind of film work, it creates kind of a rigor to your approach. I think through architecture, you learn about composition and scale and color and texture. And, these 4 images here, for example, that I took, another set of supervised by art directors Tuesday Stone, was just an opportunity again to try and document all of the fabulous work from the set designers and the scenic artists and the graphic artists. And I guess it plays into, my tendency to shoot things front on in an elevational sense, because that's the way they're documented on paper to communicate them. And I think I'm always looking for that rhythm and order in these objects as I shoot them, like these banners in the bottom right of the page here. These were all conceptualized and then hand painted. They're probably, 15, 18 foot high, these banners. So yeah, it becomes I think a logical extension of both my architectural training and drafting and documenting things on paper. And then again, how does that appear in a frame? How does that appear in an image? I guess in a literal sense, the frame becomes like an analogy to the piece of paper on which I drew the set. You were asking about Graceland earlier. So this top image is the finished set in the film, and the bottom one also, you can see Austin Butler walking out of the set there. So we built probably 1.5 stories or so, including the whole front colonnade. And then all these interiors were built practically on the sound stages on the Gold Coast. And they are forensic matches to Elvis's interior house. And Catherine Martin and the team went to Memphis to survey and photograph and look at these buildings in detail so that we could recreate them. Some more concept illustrations.
I'm
very
curious about that. I'm curious about that. Why recreate it?
Oh, and not shoot there?
Yeah. Why not? I'm just
because it's very, very difficult to shoot on location typically. I mean, for one, it's a public museum that's pretty well open 365 days a year. So to take a film crew from Australia to shoot in Memphis just for the Graceland shoot component is, financially and logistically kind of incompatible with the film. The film was being made in Australia with an Australian director, Australian production designers, Australian crew, everyone working under the banner of Warner Brothers. So yeah, it comes down to money and logistics basically. So it's cheaper to build a set in an environment that can be controlled in terms of lighting and access. And each of those studio sets, and you can see some of them under construction in these frames, walls can be floated for camera access. Parts of the ceiling can be taken out for lighting access. You can't do that in a real location. So it becomes quite inflexible. And in that top right-hand image, you can see the set under construction. So that's how much of Graceland we built as an exterior there. More photographs.
It's interesting. I think the art direction and the construction of these worlds and stuff like that is it's fascinating, and how it translates into a final product. And the work that goes behind creating these moments for a camera. And that movie that movie was so famous. I think Austin Butler couldn't shake his Elvis accent, from what I hear. It was
he was very very much consumed by that role. He did an amazing job.
Yeah, he did.
This is Elvis's tour bus, or our interpretation of Elvis's tour bus.
He really did live a very lavish life, didn't he? He was I remember Graceland was just, you got to go to Graceland. It was almost like Mecca or something. You got to make it to Mecca.
Yeah,
Elvis was such a, it was a very big element, of my upbringing, considering I'm from Texas or whatever, and Elvis was big there too. But he was big everywhere. But in
his final years, he basically played every day of the week for, I think, something like 6 or 7 years in the International Hotel here, and until his sad demise. Yeah. But there's a little bit of a taster anyway of some of those environments.
I just remember Elvis in those Hawaii movies, those old Hawaii movies. I remember growing up, and man, I want to go to Hawaii, and he was just such an icon, and to kind of represent a world like that, I bet it was an honor. I bet it was really fun to kind of rebuild that time.
It was, and it was one like that, felt, and you want to do with respect as well. Of
course. Yeah. So talk to me about the research that goes into it. Like, how in depth do you go? I know you showed me some of the source images, and you looked at some photography from the time, but talk to me about that. How in depth? How long does it take? Talk to me a little bit about that.
Well, the process started years before my involvement. I mean, Baz Luhrmann, our director, and Catherine Martin, his life and creative partner, they met the Presleys years ahead of, this project coming to light, and, have personal discussions and anecdotal accounts of his life. And, they go very, very deep to make sure that this character is represented with the greatest authenticity and the greatest respect, basically.
What do you take into account when you're actually designing a location? What are you taking into account? Does it go beyond photography in some ways? I know you use them as references and stuff like that, but what other considerations are you doing for your research?
Well, I think there's historical considerations, like with Beale Street in particular. I mean, we honored the graphics of Lansky Brothers. I mean, the creative team ahead of my time met with the Lansky estate. There's practical concerns. You can't use a brand's name or even their historical image without clearing its use for the film. So, there's legal considerations, there's historical considerations, there's making sure that the brands and their history are represented in the most accurate way. And then obviously there's all the minutiae of creative considerations, colors, textures, scale. The photography that I do on these films is 1% of the rest of my work, but it's something that I'm happy to do, as I mentioned earlier, to document what we've created, and ultimately those assets are available for publication, for awards, for whatever purposes then come to light in the years that follow. I mean, they're sitting on a server somewhere in Warner Brothers, but they form part of the legacy of the film, I guess.
I think it'd be interesting to kind of see if you've done that throughout the years, to see a book of your photography with these constructed sets. You would be a regular Gregory Crewdson, you know what I mean? Like,
that'd be great. It's a little bit of a gray area though, because technically any of the work that we create on these projects is not our own. It's not like my photography work where I own the copyright.
That's interesting.
And so I'm probably not at liberty to ever do that, if I'm frank. But, there is a limited number of stills available online. There's been articles in Vogue with Catherine Martin being interviewed and Karen Murphy being interviewed, etc. And there's images associated with that, but it's not a body of work that's technically mine, if that makes sense.
That's interesting. That is really, really interesting. All the hands that are at play and that play into it. There's a reason the credits are so long at the end,
Yeah.
And so it's there's so much and there's so many people involved in it, and I really appreciate you taking the time to kind of take us through what it took. I know you didn't share all the stories per se, and I was taking a very photocentric gaze at it, you know what I mean, seeing a constructed world, but it was really interesting to look at. Now I'm kind of curious about your work and your photography that you do when you're not doing this. So you have a couple of bodies of work, your latest body of work and the one prior to that, and so or before that. And so let's take a look at that, and let's share that first body of work that you have prepared for us. And this became a book, correct?
Yeah, both. Well, in fact, all three series that I've shared publicly, I've turned into self-published artist books, sort of limited run artist books. I think the first two series I made about 80 copies. This latest series I've made 200 copies, sort of signed editioned artist books. But I think that's motivated by, you can share a very limited number of images in a physical exhibition, both logistically and financially. And, if you want to share a story in greater depth, a book really is, the most logical way to do it. And there's something very, precious to me about having a tangible physical record of that process. I mean, I still meet people now who go, "Oh, I got your Wabi-Sabi book." And I'm like, "Oh, did you?" Like, I didn't see them buy it, or I didn't see them necessarily engage with it. But out there, these little pictures of history that, people are still enjoying. There was a chap who came to my latest show, which is still on for another week here in Sydney, which is a geographical study of the social changes that are affecting Shikoku Island in Japan. And I'd never met him before, but he said, "Oh, no, I came to your last show. I have Wabi-Sabi." And I think that's where the real joy comes for me, is that, it's had an emotional imprint on people, and people have been... Wabi-Sabi was a collection of works that I first shot in from 2006 through to about 2015. And if I'm perfectly transparent about the series, when I first started shooting in 2006, they were quite, I guess, incidental. But on subsequent trips to Japan, as I noticed the effects of these social changes, I started shooting very deliberately to document mostly in the larger cities. So in Osaka, Tokyo, and the outskirts of some other townships I visited in, mostly on Honshu Island, one of the biggest islands, big land masses that comprise Japan. And so this image on the left, for example, you'll note is two closed shop fronts, vanished awnings. The image on the right is actually some ferry chairs on one of the ferries that crosses to Naoshima Island. But I decided to pair these images kind of as a diptych, typically one architectural one non-architectural one, that kind of spoke to each other and spoke to both the increasingly aging population in Japan, the decline of these villages, but at the same time often also a pivot point to something more contemporary. So it's a dialogue between old Japan and new Japan in a sense. So on the left here we have a town in an image of a closed shop in Shima Onsen, which is about 2 hours from Tokyo, where I was staying, and about 80% of the village, I think, was shuttered. Very few people, most of the shops closed. And on the right, you have this guard outside a building in central Tokyo, designed by the French architect Le Corbusier. And oftentimes I would be finding an association between two images in terms of color or form or texture. And they were hung like this in the gallery. So when I made the book, I decided to pair these images opposite each other. And the book was titled Wabi-Sabi because I felt the book and the images spoke to this Japanese aesthetic philosophy of celebrating the impermanence of things and beauty in things that show the passage of time. And so these two images, I think, speak perfectly to that. On the left, we've got this decaying building facade that very much shows the pattern of age and the years of use. And on the right, we've got a car park with sort of these circles of melting snow. So both images, I guess, speak to transience. That image on the left is, in fact, the image that's behind me, which is a second-hand wares shop in Tokyo, in a suburb called Hikifune. And on the right, we have an image of out of Arata Isazaki's tower, famous Japanese architect. He did this art tower in Mito City in Ibaraki. And I thought there was an interesting correlation between the little forms of all these second-hand objects and then the stacking and repetition of forms in this Japanese city, this vignette out this window.
So talk to me a little bit about that. Go ahead.
I guess what I was going to say, though, is I never went to lengths, I think, to point these out to people, but it was very interesting how many people got it, how many people made that association. People who unsolicited said to me, oh, look, the microwaves look like the buildings in the... And so I guess they saw these repeated patterns at a micro level in the Japanese streetscape, and then zooming out to a city, you see the same sort of repetition at a larger scale.
Yeah. Oh, I definitely noticed it. I'm actually seeing your eye play out. I'm actually seeing how you're actually visually comparing these things together and how they actually link. And it's really interesting.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I haven't looked at these images for a very long time, so it's very interesting for me to open this up again, almost a decade on.
Wow!
So that's an abandoned hotel on the left, and then this image of the river is actually directly opposite. But that's melting. What do they call it? Like the snow float. So that's all coming out of the Japanese Alps. This blue water from molten ice and snow, and the association between these stained drapes on the left and then the molten river on the right was really something I wanted to communicate.
It's you have a really interesting visual. Yeah, I can see your visual comparisons. Some people do it with subject. Some people do it with like the topics and stuff, but like I can see you actually, I can see your eye. And that is a great place to be in photography, by the way. Right. And when somebody stands in front of an image and they get it right away, that is, in my opinion, that's what you want. And diptychs are hard. They're often it's an exercise you do in art school, but it's not an easy thing to do, and it seems like you did it quite well. How many images are in this book? And how many did you shoot?
There's about 60 images in this book, but I spent a long time sequencing them. It's like some of them are film, some of them are digital, and I did want them to appear consistent in their presentation. The image on the left, for example, is taken on a digital Fuji X series, probably an X Pro 1 at this time. Like I think they're up to X Pro 4 or 5. And the image on the right is a film image taken on an old Canon SLR.
I think you do a nice job.
Sorry?
I think you do a nice job matching them. That's not easy to do. You have a clear palette that you're working with.
Yeah, thank you. And I guess some images like this, whilst the image on the left speaks to the stillness that exists in these villages and starts to hint at the social changes that I document more thoroughly in Shikoku Silence, some of them, in a way, were a little bit of a visual folly as well. So for me, these bridges and these overpasses were strongly mirrored in the texture of the stonework. And often the association was not necessarily as deep as some, far-reaching social statement. The image on the left here, you have everything gathered in plastic waiting to be collected, to be taken to trash. And on the right, you have all these people sheltering in a not dissimilar way.
I like your irony.
Skins of plastic over each other. This is kind of a personal.
So talk.
Yeah.
Go ahead. Sorry.
I was going to say this is kind of a personal pair of images because this was the workshop of a friend's, who wasn't that young himself, but of a friend's deceased father, and he just left his father's workshop like that. So that's the interior and exterior of that workshop. But it kind of spoke perfectly to this aging population and I guess the stillness that comes with the passing of somebody. Talk
to me about that context a little bit. And you're kind of referencing kind of the social, there's this overarching kind of thing you're observing. And I'm curious a little bit about that story. So for those who don't know a little bit about what you mean by the aging population or whatever, like kind of unpack that for me a little bit. Tell me that story a little bit. I'm curious.
I think I believe Japan now has one of the oldest, if not the oldest, populations in the world, and one in 10 people are aged over 80 years of age. And for a long time, since the Second World War, in my readings, the Japanese countryside and rural communities have been in decline. In not dissimilar a way that we spoke of earlier about, villages going into decline in the United States. But I think that's probably more economically driven than driven by the factors that are affecting Japan. I mean, Japan has a very low birth rate and a very old population. So the population as a whole has been declining for a long time. And young people have been leaving rural centres to go to the major city centres for employment and education. So what you can imagine here in this village, in this image on the left, for example, again in Shima Onsen, is with no new children being born into these villages, eventually the schools close down. And then once the local schools close, those people move to a city where there is a school that's active and there's more children. So increasingly these smaller towns and villages and regional centres are falling into decline because the villages basically become unsustainable. There's not enough people living in these cities to leave the lights on. Now, whilst the images in Wabi-Sabi spoke more to a sense of beauty in the impermanence and beauty in things that are ephemeral or showing the passage of time or age, the subsequent series, Shikoku Silence or Shikoku no Seijaku in Japanese, speaks very specifically to that social issue. So whilst Wabi-Sabi had many shops in it, like this image on the left of the optometrist, which is closed and no longer functioning, it was, I guess, not always explicitly talking to that story. It was a conversation between these two images, often with a decaying facade or an aging facade or something that showed the textures or the passage of time, like this old shop and home here on the left, and then the pristine, very famous Ryoanji in gardens in Kyoto, the very famous stone garden, which of course is pristine and maintained the way it has been for many, many decades. So I think in creating this series and this book, I noticed the fallout of these social changes. But the context and content of the book was not explicitly about that, whereas Shikoku Silence is explicitly about that in a very specific geographic location. So I went to Shikoku Island, which is the smallest of the 4 major land masses in Japan, to see what I could see in terms of the evidence of these social changes on the built environment. This image on the left is really significant to me. It's an old home entrance, and all the contents have been piled up against the glass. So whether someone is still there or not, I very much doubt it. And this image was taken in 2012. So that image now is more than a decade old. And this problem has only continued to become more and more evident in rural Japan.
So what draws you to...
And there's 60 images in this book, and I think a similar number in the latest series. That image on the left is an old tofu restaurant.
What draws you to Japan?
Look, I first went to Japan, I think, because of its significant place in the history of the arts and architecture and typography and furniture design and just about everything to do with the visual arts. The Japanese have played a major role in its history and development. And I first went there in 2006 because I was just so compelled to go there and see something different. I never went thinking that I would develop this creative attachment to this kind of storytelling, but I did. And that's pretty well the whole book. I've just toggled it.
It's wonderfully laid out. I love the diptychs, especially that those last 4. I was quite taken by, and
thank you.
I'm curious. Like I'm seeing a connection. It seems like your eye was drawn to something in the U.S. and you were drawn to Japan, from that original inspiration, but you started to notice something similar going on here. When you see something like this going on, how does that make you feel? What are you feeling in those moments?
Look, there's quite a less so now because Japan has become incredibly popular with Western tourists. It's very, very popular, particularly for Australians to visit there because it's not that far away. But when I first traveled there in 2006, there was very little English signage. It was quite a lonely experience in much the same way as riding a motorcycle through the middle of Alabama is a lonely experience. Like there's not a lot of connection, and particularly when you don't have the language comprehensively. In Alabama, it was an absence of people. In Japan, it was also an absence of people. But the people you did meet, you don't necessarily have the ability to engage in a very meaningful way. So it does become, you feel like it becomes quite an observational role. You very much relying on your eyes more than your words. And I think that's probably why I became so passionate about taking photos in Japan, because it's a way to relate that you don't have the advantage of speaking to what you're seeing, so you capture it, if that makes sense.
How's your Japanese getting? It seems like you're spending a lot of time there.
Look, not of late. I mean, the last time I was there to shoot this Shikoku series was 2019. And, I'm embarrassed to say that I've only ever really acquired some basic conversational Japanese. But I have tried learning it, but obviously in Australia I went to night college here to learn it for a time, but without repeatedly practicing it, it's not something you retain.
Yeah, you can lose it. Yeah, it's really interesting. So I am fascinated by this. It seems like not only is it a photography practice, but it's almost like a study that you're doing. How did it translate into that next body of work? You said it started to really come together there. So talk to me about that, and let's jump into that project as well.
I think the difference is Wabi-Sabi, if I'm honest with the audience, which I always want to be, was in part a retrospective collation of what I'd seen, if that makes sense. Like, a lot of photographers like to say, I spent 20 years shooting this, and every image I thought about, for an hour before I took the like I'll be the first to say that it wasn't, it was curated in a sense. I had a decade of images that I'd taken along certain themes, but I hadn't ever conceptualized that I would share it as a body of work or even create a book from it. And then as I started sitting with the images, collating, sorting, sequencing, I went, wow, there's some really interesting conversations here between these diptychs. And I had very much started to understand how many of these rural communities had fallen into decline, but not only rural communities, but suburbs on the outskirts of the major cities, or even suburbs within cities where massive malls had been built in Tokyo. And the street that used to sell exclusively a certain kind of cookware was now completely shuttered because people would go to the equivalent of American big box stores, but they'd go to a Japanese mall to buy their cookware. They didn't go to the one street that was famous for cookware anymore. And so the difference between Shikoku silence, which we'll call it for ease, is that I went there very deliberately in quite a short period of time. I gave myself 2 weeks to go to Shikoku and shoot the series, to which some of my photographer friends are like, don't tell them that. Tell them it was like years of dedicated focus. But honestly, I went there going, I think I'm going to see what I'm going to see. I want to tell this story. I went to Shikoku deliberately because it is the smallest of the 4 major land masses. So I felt that it would probably have suffered the effects of these social changes more in a more pronounced way, maybe than some of the less remote places. And it became a bit of an Easter egg hunt. I had a little 1-liter car. Most of the roads in Shikoku are single lane, twisty mountain roads like you wouldn't believe. It takes you an hour to go 20 miles. And it's not a very big place, but it's very densely vegetated. It's very mountainous. It's very remote. And yet around this island, which is not terribly big, are scattered a lot of townships and villages that evidence exactly, the things that I've been talking about. So I can bring some of those images up if you wish.
Yeah. And I will say to your photography friends that I have talked to a lot of people that kind of start off with a curiosity and stumble into a body of work all the time. That happens all the time. So some people start off with a lot of research. I talked to one individual that just had an intuition and just started photographing and had no idea what they were going to end up with. And then a year into it, they realized what they were doing, and bam, there was the project. And so I don't think there is a clear method or a good way or a bad way to do it. So I really appreciate it. I think you're asking really interesting.
I don't think so either. For some people, it can be very organic. Some people work in a very deliberate way. They won't even press the shutter till they've spent 4 year researching something. There's no...
I'm not that way. I'm a very intuitive person, so yeah. Yeah. All right, let's take a look.
So I made this book bilingual, and there's an interesting reason behind that. Is I really wanted to involve a Japanese audience, and these pages that I'm toggling over here are quite a detailed academic forward by a doctorate friend of mine who I studied architecture with, and then the equivalent translated into Japanese. And the reason why it was important to me to make it bilingual is I wanted a Japanese audience to feel A, respected, B, involved, and C, to feel like they had a seat at the table when it came to talking about the issues that were affecting their own country and particularly their own landscape. So I went to great lengths to get it properly translated, and all the image captions, etc., also in Japanese. And I've sent a number of the books to Japan. The books are for sale through my website, but there's 200 signed edition copies only, and a number of them have already been to Japan, and it's been amazing to hear feedback from Japanese people. And something that I wanted to circle back to that you mentioned earlier was about this idea of not noticing your environment, or in a sense being blind to the things that are immediately around you. And I think it's very hard when you live in a place to see it through somebody else's eyes, or see it from a distance for what it is. And so I didn't want this book and this series to be a voyeuristic take on someone else's country or community. I wanted them to feel like it was a conversation. And so the images that are here are all large format, black and white images. So they've been taken on a medium format digital camera. See if I can make them slightly bigger and still toggle. No, that does not work. So we'll stick to the old game plan. So this first image, which was the opening series of the opening image of the show, it shows you the kind of landscape that is predominant in Shikoku. And yet the Japanese government, no, thank you. The Japanese government, from the people I spoke to, seemed to think that by introducing more infrastructure and more modernity, that will somehow invigorate this place. And so this image speaks to that juxtaposition between this very remote place and this tremendous white bridge that's been hit by a dash of sunlight.
The contrast is amazing.
This is an old Japanese, an old Chinese restaurant that had this architectural folly of a ship built as an entrance way to the restaurant. And to see it being reclaimed by the landscape like here, I just thought was quite an iconic sort of contrast.
This image here was one of my favorites.
The boat?
Yeah. I just think there's something humorous about it. It's very yeah. What's that?
It is peculiar.
Yeah, exactly. You don't expect a very large ship to be parked in the parking lot, and so it's just funny. In your angle on it, it doesn't give you that impression that it is an entrance. It's just this weird thing. So go on, continue.
True. No, it's very true, and I think that's what sort of isolates it. In a funny way, I wish the building wasn't there on the left, but it would be a bit more. But there is sort of a balance between the mountain and the restaurant roof. I mean, this is actually the whole book I have here. So, these images are not yet online. 23 of these images are on show at the moment at Wallara Gallery in Sydney, but after that show comes down at the end of this week, probably shortly after you share this, I guess they will live on in book form. This is actually a karaoke parlor by the side of the highway. And these little doorways left and right lead to little karaoke booths where you could take a pause from driving. And but the whole courtyard's overgrown and the reception area was full of mold. And you can see that the forest approaching through the end of the breezeway here.
It's just stop off and get a little sing in,
Yeah, stop off and get a little sing. This is a very old signboard in the shape of a golf ball that is offering 120% excitement if you come to the country club and the restaurant and stay a while and play some golf. But it's a little hard to see here, but the texture in this sign is quite remarkable.
Yeah.
So yeah, I don't know. This is an interesting image. The gallery didn't want me to include it, but it's there, and it's actually caused quite emotional responses from a lot of people. Like it's I felt it was important because it communicates without any images of buildings or decay where we are. Like, it gives you a very strong sense of place. Just to show you this deep, deep valley. This is the beginning of the Iya Valley in central Shikoku. And you can see the river and the mountains raising up out of it.
Why did they object to it?
I think they felt it was off narrative, you know, like I think it was like, oh, well, you know, there's other things here that speak more to the theme. But the one thing I've learned over the years is when I first showed, I asked a lot of people, you know, is this one good? Is this one good? Which one should be? And I had a new friend come to the show on the weekend who is contemplating his own series. And he said, what's the one bit of advice you'd give me when it comes to, you know, trying to sequence my own work? And I said, from lessons that I learned the hard way, I said, listen to less people, ask less people. You really have to try and find your own voice with it. Otherwise, your series or your book or whatever you're hanging in the gallery just becomes a dilution of the 25 people that you asked. You know, it's like I think you end up with a Lexus, you know, like it becomes designed by committee. Yeah. You don't end up with a Camaro, you end up with a Lexus. So I think whether you are successful or not in your sequencing for your gallery show or your book, it sort of doesn't matter because it was your voice. I think it's important to find maybe one confidant who's maybe a photographer or another kind of creative, maybe one confidant who can be your sounding board, who you trust if you're deliberating over two images. But I remember my very first show, gave a lot of my agency away to the gallerist, and I wasn't happy in the end with the size or the sequencing, you know, but it took me probably these 3 series to find a stronger voice in. So I pushed back and I said, no, look, we need that image. And I'm glad I did because a lot of people have really enjoyed it.
Yeah, I like that ability to kind of take you into, you know, a lot of times with these, you know, you stick so close to theme, you lose the larger picture. And I'm glad you held strong on making sure that you include the all of the context that's necessary in order to tell the story at its fullest. So I think that's really, really good.
A lot of these, thank you. I'm glad you see that. A lot of these images are obviously not in the show because there's 60 something here, but there's an old shop here hidden in the weeds, and over the top of it is this giant freeway structure. And so there was the remnants of a village beneath this giant piece of civil infrastructure. And so this, you know, if you saw this image in isolation without knowing where we were, without knowing we were in Shikoku or the backstory I've given you, you may not see any significance in it. But I think in the context of the body of images, it becomes more relevant. This is an old concrete factory. This incredible patina on the towers. And in a funny way, subconsciously, I'm probably referencing the work of Burnt and Hilt Becker, you know, who did those typographical studies of manufacturing towers or gas cylinders. I don't know if you're familiar with their work, but quite famous for doing those typographical studies of. And I think that comes through sometimes in my work as well because of that idea of having typologies, you know, building typologies that are seen over and over and over again. This image is in the show, and it's quite an interesting one. It's an old piece of, it's like the back of a ship with a shipping container. And it was a ramen noodle restaurant, but it's since long closed. And I'll make it a little bigger for the sake of the conversation. There's brand new vending machines here and this handrail that leads your eye into it. But a Japanese lady on the opening night told me an interesting story. She said, do you know what this says? And I said, oh, it's a shipping company. I translated it on Google Translate. And so this old container has the remnants of this shipping company logo on it. And she said, yeah, it is a shipping company, but not just any shipping company. It's what they call night movers in Japan. And if you've suffered a divorce or some kind of social shame, or, one of your children's done something embarrassing such that you need to leave town, these people will come in the middle of the night and pack up your entire life. And by the time your neighbors wake up, there's not a sign of you. And I just thought it was a very interesting backstory to this image, that on the side of this disused and abandoned ramen restaurant is this company, which is the night movers.
Wow. What a whoa. Don't get me wrong, it's not like I haven't felt like that every once in a while, but that is fascinating.
Handy, right?
Yeah. Well, but that's it's almost poetic.
Yeah, it is, and it speaks to the deeper themes also.
Yeah. That's really, really interesting.
Of impermanence, and disappearance, and fading memories.
Yeah. While you do these, and you take these images, and you're kind of collecting these experiences and these images, what have you discovered throughout this whole process? Is there anything that's you kind of preconceived notions that kind of got unpacked that maybe are packed? I'm curious about your discoveries.
I don't think anything's ever like you imagine it was going to be. Like, I got to Shikoku and I thought, I'll find these, things simply and easily, and it'll be a fun journey. It'll be a rewarding journey. It again became, strangely, the things that unites all three series is that it was quite a lonely journey and a very individual one, where it was really just me and what I was observing. So this image here of this abandoned gas station, I probably didn't even see another car. And what you do see in Shikoku is it's very famous as a pilgrimage destination, and both Western and Japanese tourists do this pilgrimage around Shikoku between, I think there's 88 temples that you can visit on this ancient pilgrimage tour. It's done on foot. It's done in very specific robes. So it was quite a surreal experience. As I traveled around, you would occasionally see these pilgrims walking with these wide-brimmed white hats and these white clothes, usually with a timber stave, and then a little book that you would collect stamps from all these temples that you visited. So when you say, what did I learn? I mean, it was just a very surprising experience, to find yourself in this remote mountainous location. And the subjects were not always easy to find. I was only there for a short time. I probably took something like 1,400 images in those 12 days. And then ultimately distilled them down to this 60 images. And I kind of set myself two rules, I suppose. One was, if it didn't speak to the theme, which was rule number one, then it had to be something that spoke to me personally. And I guess it's like any kind of photographic journey, like the viewer who sees the book or the show doesn't know the story that sits behind it. They might know that it's an abandoned onsen bath like this one, but there's a whole gamut of feelings that went along with being in this incredibly remote location. And you can see it's perched on the coastline here. Black corridors running off to blackness in every direction, and not a sound to be heard. It was often quite isolating. So I guess I learned that, there's not a lot of connection to be had often in these experiences. But it's interesting now how the connection's paid forward. I've had wonderful experiences at the gallery talking to both Japanese and guests from Sydney and all over the place about the work, about how it makes them feel. So whilst there's an absence of connection probably in the process of making these images, it's interesting how much connection has grown out of it for me.
What did they say?
The people at the gallery?
Yeah. Give me some of those feedbacks. I'm curious.
On the whole, people are quite moved, much more so than I would have thought. People universally see the stillness and the beauty in the images. It was very important to me that I didn't make what I guess would be coined kind of ruin porn, if that makes sense. I think there's a tendency.
No, I've heard that many times. Yeah.
I think there's a tendency in like the urbex community to be like, oh, here's an old school and this desk has fallen on this doll's head. I'll take a macro shot of that with the feeding window and bushes in the background. And
what an instant visual. There you go. Yeah.
But you know what I mean? Like, it does tell a story, but I don't think it tells it necessarily in a very, very respectful way. You know, like it's not. And that's not to denigrate a photographer's work who chose to do that. Like, I'm being kind of humorous with it, but you know, if that's your bent and you're an urbex photographer, then I celebrate you. I mean, that's awesome. But my agenda in creating these images was to sort of photograph these places, but do it in a way that both memorializes and celebrates the people and the communities that are either no longer there at all or are very much in decline, because it was important to me that it was done in a respectful way. So this pool deck here, there's a sort of a 50-yard pool to the left, and it's full of leaves and rubbish and junk, but these lines being cast by the afternoon sun across the pool deck in juxtaposition to the vines here, I just thought was very, very beautiful. So that's how I wanted to capture these places. And that's been reflected back to me in comments from the gallery. I think people have felt that respect. And I was interviewed by a Japanese journalist the other day, Yumi Oba from SBS Broadcasting here in Sydney. She came down to the gallery and she found it moving and beautiful. And a couple of people have said to me, "Oh, are the Japanese offended by this portrayal?" And I went, "Not that I'm aware of," because I think every single one of them have kind of lent into what's the word I'm looking for? Kind of the reverence with which I've tried to capture these subjects. You know, this is a very banal image at face value. It's a storage cylinder for liquid natural gas. But I find the layering, the wires, like, why is this in an image about social decline? It's again like the image of the river and the mountains, giving you some broader context about where we are. Like, it's an image about place more than about an image of decay. Likewise, this radio tower and these empty streets. Like, this is a place called Tosashimazu down in the south coast of Shikoku. You know, contemporary buildings, nice clean streets, not a soul inside.
Yeah. And that tower is almost Eiffel Tower-esque.
It is a little bit.
So, yeah, not exactly, but it's kind of got that, that. It's interesting.
True, yeah. Completely empty vending machine in front of an old roadside stall. Countless numbers of these roadside stalls just sitting abandoned.
It's a fascinating look. It makes you wonder why someone would even ask if someone would be insulted by this or whatever. But
I think it's a very Western mindset, and it comes back to this notion of wabi-sabi that we touched on before. Like, if we have a cutting board and it starts to look a bit shabby, we're like, oh, I better buy a new cutting board. It's a very Western sensibility. Yeah. This is worn out, I better get a new one. Whereas the Japanese very much, they'll find much greater value in a chef's knife where the handle is taken on the form of the chef's hand and the imprints of the fingers than a new knife. This is a knife that shows evidence of use and the passion of his craft. And I think that notion of wabi-sabi and celebrating the pattern of years in objects and the built environment, and even in the landscape, translates to even the way they look at these things. This is a pachinko parlor, which is a form of Japanese gambling, using these little ball bearings in like a slot machine. And it's long closed, but it's long closed because the people that played it, this is a very big building with rows and rows of pachinkos in it, I imagine, at one point. There's no longer enough people to service this building. But I've never got the sense that anyone's looked at these images and gone, you're being in any way, less than respectful about the subject matter. So I'm happy about that.
Well, you have yeah. Well, and you also have I don't like this word, but you have a very clean aesthetic. It's like, they're constructed well, as far as the composition goes. And so you can see the care that you're into photographing it. And even the series by which you're actually showing the images, there's a sense of care in there. And so I think it's fascinating too, is that like, I think I've seen one person in your images. Yeah. Was there,
I don't deliberately omit them either. Like a lot of people say, oh, did you paint them out, or did you wait till there was no one there? And these are very quiet places. And this image here is actually a former barber. And I don't have GPS, tracking on my camera. So oftentimes when I went back to find the Japanese place name in Google Street View, I was laboriously driving up the road in Street View looking for these buildings.
Wow.
This one's demolished. So what was also interesting, I think, about the series is it is a snapshot in time, because a lot of these ruins, which are referred to as haikyo in Japanese, haikyo, are also being removed and being demolished. And one of the concepts that my friend and colleague, Dr. Mike, speaks to in the foreword about is this notion of what he coins the everyday unseen. And I think it's what I was clumsily trying to explain before. It's like, if I go out in Sydney today to try and shoot a series of images, it's incredibly difficult because I'm almost blind to my environment. But when you come into it,
I have this conversation a lot. Yeah.
When you come into an environment that's not your own, all of a sudden you see it like as a newborn. It's
yeah.
And I think the interesting phenomena I had reflected back to me from Japanese people who've seen these images is, oh, I never noticed that, or I didn't see that, or, oh, these are our villages, really? Like that, it's sort of bringing to attention a phenomena that they've probably walked past.
It's so true. It is so true. I've always noticed that. And that is fascinating. That's a conversation we have all the time on the show.
Is it really?
So it's, yeah, absolutely. Cause it is true. I think, what did they say? The everyday unseen.
Yeah, my friend Mike, in the forward,
perfect,
the term "everyday unseen," but yeah, I don't know if it's already in the lexicon or not. But I just really liked it.
No, it's what a great way to put that. It is, it's so true. It's you often wonder. It's like, how did you not see that? Come on, it's like, you know what I mean. But when your life is in a repetitious pattern and you're kind of, getting by and surviving and just going through life in general, and things just kind of fade off into obscurity, out of your view. And the longer you're in a place, the more it gets obscured. It's like
very true.
It's just so true. It's like it's so funny. You find something in somebody's house, you're like, what is this? And they're like, I haven't seen that in years. I'm like, it's like right there. Like, what are you talking about? You know what I mean? Or I haven't pulled it out, but there's something strange about that. And there's something about like leaving and coming back that is, I don't know if it's important for human experience. Maybe it is. There's something about it. I don't know yet. I'm on this. I'm something I'm writing about. You know what I mean? But it's a fascinating thing to even think about. But yeah, I thank you so much for taking us through this. I think I just have a few more questions for you. So I know you probably have more here, but I think we're running out of time. But if you want to take us through a few more and
I'll just
finish
something really quickly on this image, because people stare at it quizzically in the gallery, but it's actually a tsunami tower. And there's countless of these tsunami towers up the whole eastern coast of Japan. But what's significant about this one, because they all have very different styles of architecture, because they're, individually engineered, there's no one design, is basically a giant disability ramp that winds its way up the tower. So it speaks to the aging population in these communities, because if the tsunami alarm sounds, these people need to be able to get up there on a walker or a little trike, and not tackle the stairs. So I find that quite a fascinating image.
It looks like something you would see at a theme park.
True.
To some kind of slide that's on the other end. But that's exactly what I was doing. I was like, "What is that? Is that just?"
It has a much more ominous background. Yeah,
I think that's wonderful. I think your work is I like the fact that you're like finding this thread, this question that pulls you into your own studies visually. And I like that you're kind of going back to a location to understand it even more. And I think it's quite fascinating. I do have one question that is kind of related to something that I think is beyond its subject, something that's kind of related to you. Do you feel like, you have this job that requires hundreds of hands, lots of input, big teams, and then you have this personal practice that seems almost lonely and devoid of interaction. You know what I mean? Do you feel like you almost need that? Like, do you feel like maybe you haven't thought about it before, but do you feel like maybe this is like your way of kind of like cutting from it at all? I've worked on really big teams. I know sometimes I just want to sit on a beach and just not think for a minute. Do you feel like
I want to do that every day.
Is you can't get away from it. But no, do you see I
think there's a lot of truth in what you say. I do love collaborating on creative projects. Like, I don't really like working in a vacuum. I like to spitball ideas and move things around, and I do very much enjoy, even at the moment I'm working on smaller commercials and smaller projects in between, bigger films.
Yeah.
And I 100% enjoy those days where I get to get together with my team and problem solve and do all of that. But I think what I find most rewarding and exciting and engaging about my personal photography practice is it stands or falls entirely on my own decisions. And that's like both terrifying and also very rewarding, because it's like, and it comes back to what I was saying earlier about finding your own voice and not letting that be diluted by a whole set of external opinions. Because if you don't, someone said to me once, if you don't pursue, what do they say? Those people who don't pursue their own dreams end up fulfilling the dreams of others. And I think, like Elvis wasn't my dream. It was conceived by Baz and CM and the studio and Gail Berman and the key figures that were behind, okay, this is our IP, we're going to make this wonderful film. I'm a cog in the wheel, and I love that opportunity, and I certainly love every bit of my involvement in that project. But these personal projects are indeed that. They're very personal. And if the book was a disaster and the show was a disaster, it would be entirely of my own making. And I think that's what makes it all the more rewarding when you get this lovely feedback from people, and people feel emotionally connected to the work. They feel moved by the work. I've had messages from Japan and America, and people that have bought the book and sent me messages and gone, oh my God, I'm obsessed. This is my new favorite thing. And that's, that money can't buy any of that. No. 50 projects, no matter what you were paid, wouldn't make you feel the same way. That's really where the rewards come from. A personal project, whatever that is to you, whether it is urbex or crochet or whatever it is. I think, find your jam and don't let yourself talk yourself out of it.
Yeah, I've heard that too. It's actually funny. It's because my next question is related to that, but I do see a connection to these very large projects. You know what I mean? Where you have a very large team, and there is something great about that, really. But then when you're in your own time, you're picking these very solitude, kind of just you and the road. Yeah. And there is something about that, and that all of your projects seem to do that. But you're asking really interesting questions. And I don't know. It's there's lots of religious texts that talk about that, I think one of the more famous Christian ones is the 40 days into the forest and finds his peace. Maybe that's what you're doing in your breaks. I don't know. And maybe you got to think about that and come back on my show and talk about it. But I think I just see in that,
there is peace in the solace, but it's or solace in the solitude, or I think everything you say is very, very true. But it's not. I don't think it's a conscious thing. I think I do get frustrated when I'm just going back to back on kind of the grind of fulfilling other briefs, and I think I do find respite in pursuing my own briefs.
Yeah. It's kind of it's interesting. I like seeing it. I think it's really, really cool, and I think you should keep it up. Thanks. Next one, go to Iceland.
I really appreciate your interest in the work. Yeah. I'd like to hear more about your own craft. Fine.
Yeah. It's so funny. It's I'm kind of like you in a lot of ways, where a lot of it's in a box, and I've got to make sense of it. So it's in a box, actually one of these little hard drives. You know what I mean? It's anyway. But I guess we're at my final question. This is the question I ask a lot of people, and I have a lot of people that follow this show that are, artists themselves, and I always like to provide a little inspiration, a little advice at the end. And I've been changing the way I ask this question, because a lot of times when I ask this question, I'm like, hey, do you have any advice for people? No. Do you have any advice for people out there trying to make their way as creators? But I want to change it, and I've been changing it now because I think, after years of working or practicing or whatever, there's this moment where you wish you would have told yourself something 20 years ago. You know what I mean? True. It's like, if you were looking at yourself 20 years ago, what advice would you have given yourself to get you to the point that you are today, or wish you would have gotten? What advice would you have given yourself, the younger Damien?
Yeah, it's a very interesting question. It's one I've thought about before on my own terms. I think, given the context of the story that I told at the beginning of the conversation, it comes back to listening to that authentic voice, you know. And I think we often hear that authentic voice and then we do something different. And whether that's because we hear it, but we don't trust that it's actually the truth of what we want or need or the direction we should be heading in, or whether we hear it and we get the noise of that ambient expectation of what one should be doing or what someone else thinks I should be doing. I guess it's blowing up on that idea I've spoken to about sequencing your show or sequencing your book. It's not just the book or the show, like it's your life to sequence. So I think if I had my time over, I would probably listen less to external input. And when I heard that little voice saying, take that holiday, ask that girl out, pursue that career, like I'd do those things instead of querying whether or not it was the right course of action.
I think it's great. It's trust your gut, trust that intuition, trust that little voice. That's awesome. So tell everybody how they can connect with you. I know you self-publish some books. How can they find those? Also, if you have an Instagram, this is where we can tell people how they can find you.
You can find me just at my name on Instagram at Damien_Drew. That's Damien with an E, Damien, _DREW, or at my website. I have two websites. I have the DamienDrew.com, and you can find me on the photography tab through there, or you can go to photography.damiendrew.com, and that will at the head of that, you'll see the series Shikoku Silence, and there's book links there and more information about the series. And once the show comes down this week, I'll put a larger slice of the series up there as well, so you'll be able to check it out. And yeah, please get in touch if you have any interest. That'll be great.
It's awesome. And they also have links on there to buy prints if they want to buy prints through your gallery.
Yes, true. At the moment, that links to the gallery store, but after this week, you can field inquiries. The books are directly purchasable at links on my website,
okay,
and prints on inquiry.
Well, thank you so much for coming on. This was an awesome conversation.
Yeah, it's been great talking to you, Patrick.
It was inspiring. It was really cool to see into your world. You've got a lot going on, and I think your photography practice is amazing. I think what you're doing, I kind of want to take a respite myself on a motorcycle in November in the South. No, hold on. August in the South.
I would suggest that maybe do it in June instead.
Yeah, August. Yeah. Actually, August is that September, August is the best time in the South, because that's when it starts to switch slightly. It's not so rainy. But thank you so much for coming on.
Maybe I'll have to do it again in the other direction.
Yeah. Yeah. I have a little
I really appreciate it. I really appreciate the support of Urbanaut, and it's great to be on the podcast as well, and see you guys putting this content out to the world. It's really brilliant.
Oh, thank you so much. I appreciate it. And once again, thanks again for coming on.
Yeah, thank you. I hope to see more of you, and let's stay in touch.
To all those that have made it this far, thank you so much for joining us on the Urbanaut Podcast. If you like content like this, please like, share, and comment down below. That helps us with the algorithm and helps us get our content out in front of new people. That is a way you can support this show if you love this content. Another way, if you want to support us even deeper, is to consider joining our Patreon page or becoming a contributor on our Spotify. So if you love this content and you just feel compelled to support us in that way, please consider doing that. And as always, we'll see you next time.